Hello, everyone. I'm Paola. Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be interviewing Adriana Herrera, the author of the recently released American Sweetheart, He's Come Undone, which is an anthology of short stories, and Finding Joy, which just recently came out on June 22nd. And she also has an upcoming book on August 25th by Carina Press called Here to Stay. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Adriana, and like Paola said, I am a romance author. I mostly write contemporary romance, centering Afro-Latinx characters. So I write all kinds of people. I write queer romance. I write romance with people who are not queer, but mostly centering the Afro-Latinx experience in the U.S. for the most part, although Finding Joy is set in Ethiopia.
It is, and it's such a beautiful setting. That was actually my first question. What inspired you to write this novel? And did you always know it was going to be set in Ethiopia?
Yeah, so Finding Joy was actually the first thing I started to write, like seriously, like I want to write a romance novel. And I lived in Ethiopia for a long time, almost 5 years, between like 2005 and 2011.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
I was working for humanitarian relief organizations, and so my partner and I moved over there right after we got married. We lived there for a year. We left. We lived in Honduras for a couple of years, and then we came back to Ethiopia when my daughter was a year, like 3 months old, 4 months old.
Oh, wow.
And we were there until she was 3. So we have like I have a very deep connection to that country. I love living there. I love the work that I did there. But I also like had like very like big parts of my adult life there, like my first year of marriage, like the first few years of my kid were there. So I wanted to write something there specifically because I think that people have a really simplistic perception of what Ethiopia is like, of how the country is, the history. I think people have like a connection to, in the 80s, there were like some famine, and there's like definitely a lot of poverty, and there's definitely a lot of food insecurity there. But there's also so much more to that country. And having lived there and having had such like a profound connection to it when I lived there, I thought it would be I think it's a beautiful place to set a romance. So I thought it would be a good place to set a love story.
I love that answer. And I love that you just set the scene for us so well because you can really feel as the reader as though you are there. And that's one of the most important parts of the reading experience, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you decided to make the story in Ethiopia and then build the characters around them, or did you always know that the characters were going to be in Ethiopia, or was it just like a flashbulb instance of this is what it's going to be like, or was it like little by little?
I am pretty intentional about like what identities, what backgrounds I kind of explore in a story. And I usually have a sense for where that person comes from, just because in my books, like I really try to investigate all the different sides to diaspora. Like I came to the US when I was 23 from Dominican Republic. I grew up in the DR. Spanish is my first language. So I have a very different immigrant experience. It's for example, someone who is a second generation Dominican whose parents came to the States in the 60s, and like their parent was born here and they were born here. So it's very different. So I have to know that, like what kind of experience that person's going to carry into the story beforehand. And occupations are really important for me also in the books. I do a lot of threads on Twitter, but I talked about this the other day. In terms of Elias, who is the love interest, right? The book is narrated from Desta Joy's point of view. Desta Joy is Dominican-American, and like my child spent the first 3 years of his life in Ethiopia because his parents had been working in Ethiopia. So Elias, you know, was a cultural psychologist and did a lot. His work is really based on Frantz Fanon, who's like a really important philosopher who explored like colonialism and cognitive dissonance and all these things. So I kind of have to have a sense for what the people do and what their experience is before I kind of form the romance, if that makes sense. Because like for a man like Elias, who lived in a country where like being gay is not legal, and who is trying to make the decision of leaving, but loves his country, wants to be there, wants to do right by his country. And then Desta, who has a connection to that country that's bittersweet, like that was gonna drive how they approach each other. And so I usually know what I can do. And I try to be cautious. Like I think there's a conversation right now going on the internet about who can use what point of view. So I did a thread today, which I had been intending to do anyway, about why I chose to only have Desta be the narrator of Finding Joy. And basically I chose that because I felt like, you know, as far as I know, I don't know of any other romance that has an Ethiopian protagonist. I don't know of any other romance that's set in Ethiopia.
No, me neither.
So just from that piece, it's like that identity is really underrepresented. And because I am a person of color, like I know how delicate it is to see yourself in a story like that. And I didn't want to be in his head, because even though I can definitely connect to being queer in a country where it's not okay to be queer, or the pain of having to, you know, leave your own country, going somewhere else, knowing that you can't be your full self in your own country. I still don't know what it's like to be a queer person in a country where being queer could like mean jail time.
Okay.
Like that, I couldn't get that close to that experience. And that experience is so painful, and it's such a particular experience that I didn't feel that I could render that appropriately. So I think about all those things when I'm trying to form a story. That's a really long answer, but in short, yes, I know exactly what they were gonna do. And I did that kind of work, so I felt that it was like the best way to move the story forward, because it's work that I understand, and I could really envision them moving through Ethiopia, doing the work that they were doing, because it was work that I did for years.
It was very refreshing to see that it was only one person's point of view. And I think it's inevitable to think as a reader that it's intentional on the writer's part. And I think it was a really smart move, because otherwise I think that experience could be heavily romanticized in the way that, you know, oh, I'm a gay person living in a place where it's not okay to be gay. I have to live in the land of the free or whatever, you know? So I think it's a very smart and a very tough choice to make, but ultimately the right decision.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the piece, right? I could get close enough that I can definitely connect with the pain of having to leave. Like I had to leave my own country, and I left because I knew like I couldn't be my full self in the year 2000 in the Dominican Republic. But I love my country. I love my family there. I wish culturally things could be different, and like feeling the pain of erasure that happens in cultures where they don't even acknowledge that there's queer people. And so those pieces of it, of course I can get close enough, but I think like I can get close enough as the person who has fallen in love with Elias and seeing him go through that, but not like being Elias in those moments. But at the same time, like if I would have written that book set in the States, and Elias was here going to a PhD program, and he was out and gay and living his best life, and wasn't in a moment of incredible, like, you know, contradictions and conflict, and he was just kind of like being himself in the US, I probably would have been fine doing dual POV then, because the external conflict or the internal conflict would not have been about his identity. It would have been about I can fall in love because of whatever we make up for romance. But it's different when, you know, it's so connected to like some of the like intersections of his marginalizations. Like, I think that's really a tricky thing to do.
It's a very complex identity for sure. So I was also wondering, because you are a trauma therapist, how did you work that into Elias's character?
With Elias, like what I wanted to make him, like I think for me, what really works is writing people who are very clear on who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like Elias had a clarity, like he had a clarity that he wanted to do a specific kind of work. He understood his place in the world. Like there's moments in the book where there's like this guy who's kind of an asshole. Can I curse? Sorry.
No, it's okay. Yes, go
Okay,
for
okay.
it.
So who's kind of a jerk, and he's also working in the team. And you know, like I had like while I was writing the book, I was like, you know, he has to be able to stand up to this guy. Like he has to be able to, like, even though, yeah, this guy's like an American and technically the balance of power is off, you know, Elias, like I had to write a character who could do the things that he needed to do to like forge his path. So I think when once I got that, like Elias had to be like, you know, someone that understood his value in the world, even though there were so many things around him that made him like that were painful, or not so many things, but a few things that were really painful. Then I think I could write him authentically, at least in terms of how he engaged with the world and how he engaged with Desta.
As a reader trying to write something or trying to become a writer, it always astounds me the kind of intentionality that you have to have when approaching characters, and I think more specifically with the romance, because it's a different relationship that develops in the characters, and it's a very scary process sometimes. I pulled up some quotes from some articles that you wrote. One was from the Bustle article, where you said, as an Afro-Dominicana, when I started writing my Dreamer series, which tells the story of 4 Afro-Latinx best friends who grew up in the Bronx together, I set out to write a world where being Black, brown, and queer and immigrant wasn't the exception, but the norm. So how did you sort of apply that same thing with Finding Joy?
Yeah, so I write Black and brown worlds with like smatterings of white people. So that's like my canvas. I just don't go into a story even considering that it's not going to be a world that is centered on the Black and brown experience, whatever that is. And so to me, because those are the worlds that I grew up in, that I live in, that I've worked in. And so to me, like that's what's organic, what's natural. I think Ruby Lang in that article said something about that's how we change what universality means, and an understanding of like what world building is. Like we're world building as we write these stories, and then we're world building in terms of readers' understanding of the worlds that can exist in fiction. Like we're reframing the expectation that when you go into a book, the white experience is going to be centered in it. And so I don't write that, because there's a lot of that already. Even when I write interracial, I'm in an interracial couple. My spouse is in a interracial relationship. My spouse is white. But when I met him, you know, he had already lived in Dominican Republic. He had just finished living in El Salvador. He was moving to Ethiopia. He spoke Spanish fluently. He had an understanding of my culture that was independent of me, of my existence. Like I didn't induct him into like understanding that there's a world outside of his experience. And so even when I'm writing white characters, I try to be mindful of that as well. Like even with Jude, an American Dreamer, like Jude had lived in Honduras, spoke Spanish. And even though he had lived, like he had gone to Honduras as a missionary, I also explored like what that meant for him, what he saw, how he understood like these like imperialistic practices in other countries, and how like churches have colonized, brought in like erasure of like cultures, like not all of them do, but like that was Jude's experience. And I think that is what, bringing a lens that like really takes out like whiteness as a center. I mean, I think that's what a lot of own voices authors do, especially authors that are writing like immigrant experiences.
Yeah, and I think the most important takeaway with romantic own voices stories for me personally is how we are guaranteed a happy ending,
Right.
which is so important to see in fiction. I recently put out a thread about my unpopular opinions in musical theater, and one of my unpopular opinions was how they removed I Feel Pretty from West Side Story, this new production. And ironically, this is the first production where they hired a non-white casting Latina. So it was like, it's really interesting that you take away this moment of confidence, of the silliness of feeling pretty
Yeah.
from a girl, from a Latina who is not white. Like, why would you do that? And I think with own voices romances, the advantage that readers have is that we always get to see our stories, our bodies confident and out there and happy.
Yep. I saw that production and I have so many opinions, but that's for another interview and another day.
And another quote that I pulled, this is from the article for Remezcla, Afro-Latinx authors in romance, the challenge of needing to be seen twice.
Yeah.
You said, to me, writing queer communities of color felt like the most revolutionary thing I could do in the midst of the dehumanizing political discourse being pushed on our communities. And I think that rings even truer for the story. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how like I think like even when I started writing romance, seriously was right after the election, and it was because I was feeling like now more than ever we need more stories of like people of color who are not like in a struggle or their pain or whatever, but like it's just gotten more, it feels like more and more important. And with Finding Joy, I think it's like, you know, what's happening in the backdrop, like George Floyd and this government and COVID and like Black and brown communities being disproportionately like impacted by the virus, and like just like the have and have nots of the US in general feel just so pressing. And I feel like a story where it's like, even for men like Elias and Desta, who are at crossroads, who have to make hard decisions, who are really, you know, in positions where like they're like a little lost and feeling like their lives are going to change forever, like there's still space to fall in love, there's still space to like enjoy the place you're in, to like have hot sex, like. And I think that's like you know, like even conversations around like stories like American Dirt, where it's like, it's so, the lack of nuance is so deep and so profound that it truly does like erase the wholeness of the person, right? I think stories like Finding Joy are important because I think we can do the job of saying these are the realities of people of color in different places, and yet they can still be super happy and good things can happen in their stories and in their lives. And I think that's like what I try to do, is like present both of those things can happen at the same time.
I love that answer. And I love that they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
You can be a marginalized person living like a marginalized life and still be happy and still fall in love and have your own happy ending. So I was also wondering, because I think that all of your books contain this important aspect to them, which is nuance and also a lot of depth into the characters' experiences and identities. So do you have any advice on how to approach that in a novel, romance or not?
It's gotta be why you're doing it, right? I write romance with a mandate that I'm gonna present the Afro-Latinx experience as I know it, and try to make it as well-rounded and as complete as I can, and really explore that as Latinx people, we're not a monolith. I only write Afro-Latinx because I think like white passing Latinx experience is something that is like done by others and has and will continue to be like centered in a way that the like Latinx people with Afro descendancy haven't had. And also I'm really trying to get at like, we're not one thing. Like even with Mangles and Mistletoe, you know, I had one heroine who was second generation, you know, Dominican from New York, and the other one had been in the country for a couple of years, was like on a student visa. So and very different approaches to their culture and their identity. For the Dominican New York character, like being Dominican felt like harbor, felt like when she was discriminated against, you know, in the world, and being in the US, her Dominican identity was like her anchor. And for my recently arrived, she was constantly microaggressed about like, this is how we do things here. So she wanted to show people that she could do the classic recipes and things like that. So between them, they, you know, they were put together in a team because they were both Dominican, so they assumed they would get along. But then they didn't, because they were completely two people with completely different experiences. And so I think that's what I delight in writing my stories. That's what I get the most joy is, like presenting all these different thrusts that there are in like the immigrant experience. And so it's like a lot to think about, but I think what I want to put into the romance space, and that's like what I think I add to the romance conversation in a unique way. And so I think whatever it is that you want to do and whatever identities or experiences you need to think of, like it has to come from a place that's like mission driven. Like you have to have the conviction that you're coming in to say something that's important, and that you've done the work of like being able to like unravel that and render that in a way that's respectful and honoring those experiences. So I think that's kind of like, I think that's like the basis, and then everything else you can do with like process and work. And
I think that gets to like the nitty gritty of the intentionality. What, like you said, conviction, mission, your goal has to be kept in mind. Would you like to talk about your upcoming projects before we finish off?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things coming up after Finding Joseph. I have Here to Stay, which is an MF, and it's set in Dallas. It's like a new world, a new universe. It's New Yorkers in Dallas. It's set in a department store. And it's a lot less intense than The Dreamers, although The Dreamers weren't like super intense, but this one's a lot more like funny and just like millennials trying to like figure things out than it is like all the different sides to the like immigrant experience. Although of course there's like the heroine is Dominican Puerto Rican, so you know there's a lot of family stuff and it's like funny. I think it's cute. We'll see what readers say. And then I have a novella coming out in November that is from the Dreamers universe.
The Christmas one.
Yeah.
I'm so unbelievably excited. I also love that you add foodie things to your books, and they always make me really hungry. And it's fun. Food is one of my favorite aspects to read about, and when it's sprinkled in a romance, I think it makes it that much more delightful.
And it's such a big part of life, right? I think it's such a great way to integrate like nurturing and love and all the good things.
So thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Everyone else who's watching this, don't forget to check out the links below, because I will leave the links to buy and add Finding Joy to your TBR, and as well as Here to Stay, and to Adriana's website, her Twitter, and the articles where I pulled the quotes from. Definitely check them out. Super insightful, super interesting. So thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.